Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for being here. I'm Cedric Suzman, Director of Programming for the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and it really gives me a very special pleasure to welcome you to this sold-out program featuring Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, discussing his book, The Future of the Jews, How Global Forces Are Impacting the Jewish People, Israel, and its relationship with the United States. Stu is a great friend of the Council, and I think I can add to me personally. He's done a number of programs over the years for us, always most graciously and with great distinction, and we're really honored to have you back at a Council program. The World Affairs Council, now in its third year, is affiliated with Georgia State University, and let me recognize the Dean of the Robinson College, Fenwick Huss. There he is, thank you, next to Judge Beasley, an old friend and supporter too. And I would also like to recognize Frank Blunt and Eric Joyner, our two board members, and of course our Council President, Wayne Lord, who helps make all this possible for us. I'd also like to recognize the Consul General of Germany, Christoph Sander, and his wife. Thank you for being here. And Jay Hakes, who's the director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum, who are hosting us this evening, and we're most grateful for their hospitality and for again being able to partner with them on this program. The World Affairs Council is a membership organization, as many of you know, and I want to thank our members who are here tonight for their support. You really do make programs like this possible and help to keep Atlanta at the forefront of international affairs and, as we're starting to say, as a global hub in the world economy, because we are indeed in that position, thanks to companies like UPS, who support us as well as other multinationals. But for those of you who are not yet members, I'd urge you to fill out the membership form that's on your seats and was handed out with the program. And please drop it off at the end before the book signing as you go to buy Ambassador Eisenstat's book, which I know you'll want to do. So, of course, you can also join online at our website. Now, I would like to thank the Wilmington Trust for sponsoring tonight's event. You may well ask, well, why the Wilmington Trust? Well, the reason is basically Bill Schwartz, a very supportive council member, and as we've said jokingly sometimes, an FOS, friend of Stu's. Bill, or William B. Schwartz III to his friends, is senior advisor of Wilmington Trust, one of the oldest trust companies in the United States, founded over 100 years ago by the DuPont family. Bill met Stu when he was a freshman at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Stu was a junior. I believe Stu induced him into student government, and they've been friends ever since. Bill is also vice president and treasurer of the family foundation, the Chatham Valley Foundation, which is widely recognized for its philanthropy in the city, and we thank your foundation and your family for that too. And is also vice president of the American Jewish Committee, Southeast region, amongst his other board memberships. So it gives me great pleasure to ask you, Bill, to come up and introduce Ambassador Eizenstat for us. And following the remarks, I'll moderate a discussion with the audience. Thank you.
I wish my wife Nina were here. She's never heard anyone applaud me. It's very exciting. Wilmington Trust, just briefly, has been involved in this community for a decade. And I just checked on some numbers today. We've given away to the community almost $4.5 million. So we're very proud of that. We're proud to sponsor Stu Eizenstat, wherever he is. To introduce him to this audience is really superfluous, unnecessary. You all know him. I don't need to talk to you about his basketball career at Grady High School, where he was All-City and All-American. or as he will tell you, he's All-American with an asterisk, pre-integration. I don't need to talk to you about his being Phi Beta Kappa at the University of North Carolina, because you know that. I don't need to tell you about his being Undersecretary of State or Deputy Secretary of the Treasury or head of the domestic policy planning staff for President Carter. You all know that. But what you don't know is that he was recognized at a very early age as a diplomat. And there's only one witness to this occurrence. And he stands before you. January 3rd, 1963. Stu very kindly drove me back from Christmas vacation to Chapel Hill. You know, the old days, you had cars, and we did, Stu did, I didn't, and we drove, I don't even know if I-85 was built. God. Man, it's a half a century ago. So we were stopped by a policeman in downtown Ludowici, Georgia. So we have lots of natives here because you know that was a speed trap. And I give you my word of honor, this is what occurred. Stu showed him his driver's license. And this public servant looked at it and said, "Eizenstat? What kind of name is that?" And Stu, to completely straight face, said, "You know, it's like Eisenhower." Ambassador Eizenstat.
That avoided a life sentence for both of us, I think. It's really a homecoming to be in Atlanta and to be at the Carter Center and to be with the World Affairs Council for a whole variety of reasons. The boat records will show that my grandfather landed in 1904 from Russia in Atlanta and lived on the south side of Atlanta. It would be somewhere around second base in Atlanta Stadium right now. And one of the great stories that my father told, and my boys say that this should be, if we ever had a family emblem on the emblem. And my grandfather spoke very little English at the time, and there was a well-dressed salesman at the door, and he was engaging in a conversation with my grandfather as much as my grandfather could speak English. And my father asked his father, "What was this all about?" And he said, "Well, it was just somebody selling something." What were they selling? Stock. What were they selling stock in? Coca-Cola, door to door. And how much was it going to cost? A nickel a share. Why didn't you buy it, Daddy? Because people will never drink colored water. Now, fast forward to the fact that I've served for about 10 years on the Coca-Cola International Advisory Board and chaired it for the last 2 years of its existence, and this is coming full circle. But there are many other connections to Atlanta and to this Carter Center. For one thing, the center itself evokes the 4 years that I spent with the president as his domestic advisor, but even before that, as his policy advisor in the '76 campaign, and even before that as his policy director in the gubernatorial campaign in the late 1960s. And history is going to treat the president much more favorably than his current contemporaries, and I'm going to be writing a book that I hope will make progress in that regard. And having people like Phil Wise and Patricia Rafshoon and Jay Hakes evokes that whole period for me. But there's another reason, and that is that my mother was, she would probably call it docent-in-chief here for about 12 years. And I used to get regular reports that she would almost attack anybody with any Washington connection, saying, "You've got to know my son Stu, you must know him." So that was my mother's connection to this wonderful place. Other connections in Atlanta are serving on the UPS board for now about a half dozen years, and Dave Avney, a senior official, is here. Frank Blunt, who's been a great supporter of the World Affairs Council. We served on the Alcatel board together, and I know that there are many friends and relatives in the audience. But the one that's the most emotional at this time is my wife died 5 weeks ago. And we spent 8 wonderful years here in Atlanta, made a lifetime of friends, largely through her, and some are here today. I see Susan and Fred Feinberg and others. When I came in from the airport, I went straight to Greenwood Cemetery as my first stop. So this is really an emotional homecoming for me, and one that I'll always remember and appreciate having the World Affairs Council, which is a great institution, sponsor. The future of the Jewish people of Israel are inextricably intertwined with the future strength of the United States. Because the United States is the home to the largest population of diaspora Jews in the world, because the United States is the greatest force for dealing with the radical enemies of the West and of the Jewish people, because the United States is Israel's only ally in the world, underscored by President Obama's stirring visit just a week ago and his moving speech to Israel's young people, reaffirming this unique relationship, which I'll discuss in a moment. Because in many ways, and I've traveled to very, very many countries around the world, the U.S., I think, is the only country in the world which truly appreciates the role that its Jewish citizens play, not treating them as outsiders, but as parts of a mosaic of varied peoples from all over the world who have added to the richness of this country. Jews are 2% of the population in the United States, 2%, but 36% of the Nobel Peace Prize winners. And so I'm going to talk to you tonight about a series of global challenges about this interconnection. Each time I look up, I see other friends like Bill Nigett, so you'll excuse me for mentioning this. But let me start with a very basic and dramatic proposition, and that is Jewish survival at all. For 3,000 years, the Jewish people have been subject, almost wherever they lived, to discrimination, to violence, to restrictions on employment, on housing, culminating in our own time after the destruction of 2 Jewish states, one in 586 BC and one in 70 of the Common Era, culminating with the Holocaust, which has engaged a lot of my public career, in which 2/3 of what had then been the center of Jewish civilization in Europe was destroyed, 1/3 of the total Jewish population in the world. There are very few peoples who could have survived this series of calamities, let alone added such richness to societies which often didn't want them. And I think that the reasons for that are, first, a tremendous attachment to Scripture. We may interpret it differently within our own ecumenical divisions, but an attachment to that Scripture, which has lasted now for 3 millennia. A determination to restore a 3rd Jewish Commonwealth, which has now been created in our own time with the enormous assistance of the United States, and a sense of peoplehood that connects Jews to each other wherever we are. And now there are a new set of challenges, and it's these challenges which integrate themselves into the challenges facing we as Americans and the United States and Israel. And I want to discuss these in the following sense. The first is the challenge of the tremendous shift of power and influence, really a historic shift, from the countries of the West, the United States and Europe in particular, which have sizable Jewish communities and share Western values, to countries of the East and South with tiny or non-existent Jewish communities and a different set of values than those which we hold in the West. This is a profound change that all of us are subject to. The U.S. has been, since the end of World War II, the ballast for world stability, for the projection of democracy, for tolerance, and for growth. And therefore, anything that affects the power and influence of the United States in the world affects us as Americans, affects Jews, affects Israel in equal portions. There are some unique features to this shift of power. For one thing, we have always been in the United States the ascending power. We weren't always, obviously, from our formation over 200 years ago, the most powerful nation, but we were always the ascending power until at the end of World War II we became, and certainly at the end of the Cold War, the predominant power. What's changed now is that other countries are cutting our lead in area after area. They are ascending. It's not so much that we're declining, it's that as we stabilize, they are ascending. China being a perfect example. China is the #1 holder of foreign reserves, the #1 manufacturer of steel, of aluminum, of autos, of wind turbines, of solar panels, and almost laughingly, recently surpassed Italy as the #1 producer of violins. We are in a slow growth mode. It may be until 2017 before we recover all the jobs we lost in the Great Recession. We have a political system that is at an impasse at a time when we need to project American power and meet our challenges. We have an impasse in Washington that is an embarrassment to ourselves and to the world. There's a second unique feature to this shift of power, and that is we've always had in global history shifts of power from one country to another. The Dutch to the Spanish, to the French, to the British, usually after major sort of cataclysmic battles like Trafalgar or Waterloo. What's different now is that so many countries are simultaneously rising, seeking their own day in the sun, and making it more difficult for the United States to develop the kind of consensus that's important for stability and for the protection of Israel and us as Americans. Brazil and Russia, India and China, Indonesia and Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, all coming up and wanting their day in the sun, not wanting to be under our domination and control. Last year, 2012, was the first year in history in which more than half of all the goods and services produced in the world, or as we call it GDP, came not from the US or Europe or the West or our allies like Japan, but rather from emerging countries. And by 2015, about 50% of all the growth will come from Asia. It's really quite profound. Now, I want to put this in context because it's such a tremendously important issue that it deserves to be looked at from the kind of perspective the World Affairs Council would want to examine it. We are not, in the United States, a beached whale as Great Britain was after World War II, depleted, exhausted. We have enormous sources of influence, great universities. There's a good reason why 100,000 Chinese are studying here. We have a productive workforce. We have a military whose power can project itself by air, land, and sea to the four corners of the world, the only country that can do that. We spend more, even with the ridiculous sequester, we spend more on defense than the next 15 countries put together. And there's a game changer that if it won't change this shift of power, will at least to some extent arrest it. And it's one that no one would ever have thought about if I were giving this speech just 5 years ago, and that's energy. We all know that we've sort of been heroin addicts to OPEC oil, importing more and more. And we talk about our trade imbalance. Half of that imbalance comes from importing oil. But what's changed through our own technology, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, and the fortuity of having shale rock all the way from North Dakota, upper New York State, all the way through down to Texas, is that within 10 years, and maybe less, we will be the #1 producer of natural gas, and we will be the #1 producer, surpassing Saudi Arabia, of crude oil. And this has profound foreign policy impacts and profound impacts on us as Americans and on our manufacturing base. We talk about outsourcing and companies going to China. Apple just announced they're taking a major plant back. Why? Because natural gas and energy are so cheap. And so this can help restore a renaissance in manufacturing as well. And this also, this energy picture can be a game changer for Israel. I grew up in a time when we used to tell the joke about Moses taking the wrong turn in the desert. He should have turned toward the east and the Gulf states. But maybe he knew something about energy too, because in the last several years, a small energy company called Noble Energy out of Houston has found major deposits of natural gas off the Israeli Mediterranean coast, the most recent only a year and a half ago, which was the 3rd largest find of natural gas anywhere in the world in the last 10 years. And this means that all the concerns about Egypt cutting off its natural gas to Israel will be a thing of the past, and Israel's debating now, when they fully mine and exploit this, do they keep it all internally, or do they convert it into LNG and export it? A nice problem to have. And Israel also recognizes that this shift is occurring, so that they've established, without in any way, of course, abandoning their special relationship with the United States, very deep trade relations with China, and they are the 3rd largest supplier of military equipment to India. The second major global force, which again impacts on the U.S., on Israel, and on the Jewish people simultaneously, is globalization itself, which I define as the rapid movement of capital, products, services, and, yes, people across national boundaries, powered by a digital internet revolution, which is changing the way we live, the way we think, the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we learn, as profoundly as the Gutenberg printing press did 500 years ago. And for sure, there are dark sides to globalization. For sure there are. Terrorist groups can use the internet to recruit, to finance, and to plan terrorist operations. Cyber attacks can now dismantle whole economies which run on computers. And anyone that's looked at the headlines of the papers just in the last few weeks knows the tremendous proliferation of cyber attacks from China, which occur every day of every week, trying to basically steal our own trade secrets. And authoritarian governments have learned how to use the internet in ways that block its citizens from having access to it. And yet, let me suggest that globalization is in many ways a great net positive for the United States and for Israel and the Jewish people. And it is for the following reasons. First, this digital revolution has created an interconnected world, which is ultimately, headlines notwithstanding, a safer, more stable world. Kenya gets 20% of its GDP from people using cell phones, and the smallest villages in Africa can connect to telemedicine and to education. And Harvard and MIT have 100,000 students from around the world who are taking courses at those schools. In addition, we've become mutually dependent through supply chains. UPS being a great example of a company that connects the world. I mean, let's think of the products we use. This cell phone, I'm probably the last to use a BlackBerry, I guess everybody else is, but I still am using it. But you know, the iPhone is made in 7 different countries, and everybody says, oh, you know, it's Foxconn, it's a Chinese company. Baloney. Less than 10% of the value of an iPhone comes from China. It requires inputs from 7 different countries. Any interruption in that supply chain means the product can't be used. So traditional wars and conflicts are simply impossible now because we are, in fact, mutually dependent, and that makes for, again, a stable, more stable world. But there's even a broader reason why globalization is good for the United States, good for the Jewish people, good for Israel, and that is because the success in this 21st century will depend on brain and not brawn. And it's built into the DNA of Americans, of Israelis, of Jews, to be creative, to be innovative, to be entrepreneurial, to be adaptable, to be flexible. Indeed, that's one of the reasons Jews have been able to survive for 3,000 years, and it's one of the reasons that the United States' future is a bright future in the 21st century. Israel has taken full advantage of this new globalized world. It has a tiny domestic market, almost non-existent. I mean, there are a little over 7.5 million people in the whole country. But because of their high-tech capacity, they now have a global market to sell to, which has made them one of the most exciting countries in the world. There are more Israeli companies on the NASDAQ exchange in New York than any other country other than the United States, more than France, Britain, and Germany put together. There are 8 universities and 20 colleges in this tiny country, and 4 of the top 150 universities are in Israel. Last year, an international study of 8th graders found Israel 7th in math and 13th in science, a great leap from only 4 years ago. A third global force, which again impacts simultaneously on the United States, Israel, and the Jewish people, is one that is of great consequence. And this is the struggle for the direction of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. 1.6 billion Muslims out of 7 billion people. Now, just in the last year or so, Islam overtook Catholicism as the religion with the greatest number of adherents. And that will grow as birth rates in the Muslim world grow. How do we deal with this phenomenon, which is so impactful on us? First of all, I think it's a danger to see our relationship with the Muslim world as, in Sam Huntington's famous words, a war of civilizations. That is the Western versus the Muslim civilization. For sure, there are elements of that. We see it every day in the jihadist attacks, trying to drive all Western influence out of Arab countries and of the Middle East more generally. We see it with Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Hamas. And yet, having traveled and continuing to travel widely in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, it's just in Indonesia, for example, this is a caricature. It is critically important to deal with, mind you. But the vast majority of people in the Muslim world want empowerment and economic opportunity and education and peace. Indeed, I would suggest to you that the real war is not so much between the West and the Muslim world, it's within the Muslim world. It's between Sunnis and Shiites, between modernizers and jihadists, between those who want to integrate into this global world and those who want to blow it up. And ultimately, as much as we can try to do to guide this conflict, it ultimately rests on the shoulders of the Muslim world to determine their own future. There were two recent UN Arab human development reports, not, by the way, by Western scholars sort of looking condescendingly at the Muslim world, but by their own Arab scholars. And they were searing self-indictments of the lack of governance, of corruption, the lack of economic opportunity, the lack of education, the lack of opportunity for women. And one fact that sort of, it's a matter of fact, but maybe it exemplifies the problem, is they pointed out that each year there are more books translated into Greek, and how many do you think those are, than are translated into Arabic. And what this created was the very powder keg that exploded 2 years ago in Tunisia and then in Egypt. This Arab Revolution is a profound impact, as much as the anti-communist revolutions were over 20 years ago in Central and Eastern Europe. They've shattered the kind of alliances that Republican and Democratic presidents painstakingly put together for the benefit of the West and, yes, Israel. And how these new alliances will come down, it's like throwing a stack of cards up in the air and not being sure how they will land. We don't know. But what we do know is they will land in ways which are more profoundly anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israel, and pro-Palestinian. Indeed, every country which has had an election after the Arab revolutions, ironically with the exception of Libya, has elected in one form or another an Islamic government. Now, mind you, they differ. I was recently in Morocco for a conference. The Moroccan Islamic government is a moderate government. Their constitution is better than the pre-revolutionary constitution. It explicitly embodies protection for their minorities, Berbers and Jews. Same in Tunisia. But so goes Egypt, so goes the Arab world. Egypt is by far the largest country, over 80 million people. And I've spent a lot of time in Egypt. And Egypt is profoundly troubling at this time. Even during the Mubarak era of seeming stability, of signing peace agreements with Israel, of being our prime ally in the region, in the Arab world, there was a sort of two-sided coin to their policy. One to the West in the United States and the other internally. And I'll give you one anecdote. I went, when I was Undersecretary of State, to Egypt, and I saw the foreign minister then, Amri Moussa, who, by the way, then became head of the Arab League and actually ran for president in the most recent election. And with the full support of the State Department, brought with me a sheath of cartoons that were the most grossly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel cartoons you can imagine. Israeli troops with grotesque features and Nazi swastikas with jackboots on the necks of Palestinian kids. And I presented this to the foreign minister, and I said, Mr. Minister, you have a peace agreement with Israel. We, the United States, support that with billions of dollars of assistance, economic and military, to Egypt. How can you expect your people to support that relationship with this kind of provocative literature? He says, you're right, this is really not acceptable, but we have a free press. And I said, well, this is an Al-Haram, this is the state-owned paper. And that's the kind of game they play, so that now that there are no Mubaraks and Ben Alis and Tunisia and the like, there's not an educated public from this autocratic pro-Western set of countries. We're operating from a playing field that's already tilted. And with the Muslim Brotherhood, started in 1928, and the mother organization of Hamas, with chapters in Jordan and other pro-Western and pro-American countries. We have a profound challenge. Now, here again, we have to be very discerning and very careful not to paint with too broad a brush. The Muslim Brotherhood clearly controls power in Egypt. It is a heavily ideological-based party. The president, President Morsi, is trying to thread a line between his own party base and the secular forces, the young Google and Facebook kids who brought about the revolution but had no agenda at all after Mubarak was gone. No organizational capacity, no political party to this day. And what we're seeing incrementally is the suppression of free speech, the suppression of opposition journalism, the suppression of opposition political parties. And this is a profound concern to a country whose northern border in Sinai abuts Israel's, and which is an easy vehicle for terrorists to come from Gaza through Egypt and back into from Gaza through Egypt and back into southern Israel. And they don't control their own border. Now, no one can say exactly where Egypt will go. They have elections coming up very shortly. I think the opposition, the secular opposition, made a mistake in boycotting those because it just cedes the whole playing field in the parliamentary elections to the Muslim Brotherhood. We are not the United States without influence. We don't have the same influence, and we will not have the same influence for our own benefit and for Israel's as we had before. We will not. But we're not devoid of it. Because the Muslim Brotherhood knows at the end of the day, they have to produce jobs and economic opportunity and good governance. And if they don't, they're going to be in trouble, and they haven't. And so they've turned to the International Monetary Fund, where we have a controlling voice for a $4.8 billion loan. They've invited, Frank, 100 business people to come over to Egypt. Ironically, 2 days after the delegation left, our embassy was stormed, not exactly an invitation to invest, but still, they know they need Western help, Western investment, and we're trying to put together a $1 billion package to help them. So we do have some leverage, but not as much as we did before. I'll talk about Turkey and Syria in a different context. Now, I want to try to tie all this together and then talk about a few other global forces in the context of President Obama's recent trip. As Wayne said in an earlier reception, we timed our talk very well with the president. I'm glad he cooperated. Let's look at the historical context of the U.S.-Israel relationship because it is unique. It's unlike any other relationship bilaterally that the United States has with any other country. And indeed, I would say it's unlike any other relationship in history in the sense that it is an extraordinary strategic alliance between the world's most powerful democracy and one of its smallest. We have showered an unprecedented amount of political, economic, military, and moral support on Israel at a time when it's often isolated. And the question is, why? Well, let me suggest, first of all, that we shouldn't over-romanticize this relationship either. From the very start, there have been major policy disagreements between the U.S. and Israel. President Truman, who courageously recognized Israel in the UN, the first country to do so, cut off arms, boycotted all arms from the United States at the time of the War of Independence when Israel most needed it. And Israel had to turn to the Czech Republic and to France for arms. President Eisenhower forced the evacuation of the joint Israeli, British, and French invasion of the Sinai when President Nasser was making provocative statements about closing it to Western and Israeli traffic. And a succession of presidents, some more, some less, but all have had concerns with Israel's settlement policy. And yet, this relationship, if anything, is stronger than ever, notwithstanding those disagreements. Why? Well, the easy but wrong answer is the Jewish lobby, Jewish power. 2% of the people do not control the policy in the Middle East. And Jews themselves in this country are substantially divided among a proliferation of organizations, left and right, with respect to what the correct policy should be of the United States or Israel and what Israel's policy should be on crucial issues. There is a firm bipartisan foundation to this relationship that depends on a whole set of factors that don't exist in any other country in the world, including Western Europe. For one, among religious Americans, and we are a religious country, Israel stands for a holy land, something to be supported. Second, people see Israel as an ally in an unstable region, a beachhead of democracy, someone with whom we can stand shoulder to shoulder against terrorists. We have a whole set of shared interests, and we get benefits from Israel as well. It's not a one-sided street. The sharing of intelligence, products that have been built into our small arms that protect against roadside bombs. The President's visit was a very important visit at an important time. And why did he make this visit as his first foreign visit of his second term when he didn't go at all in his first term, when he was 35 minutes away by air in June of 2009 when he was in Cairo? I think it speaks volumes about how things have changed in the region, that the President's major speech in his first year, in his first term, was in 2009 in Cairo, addressing the Arab world, the Muslim world. And here his first speech and first visit was in Israel. Now, I think that there were a couple of reasons why this decision was made. The first is that he recognized, because of a series of missteps which were later corrected, but some missteps on settlement policy and a few other things, that there was a deep distrust on the part of the Israeli public, and that he needed to restore that trust, and he did in this visit, in order to accomplish a whole range of things that I'll talk about in a second that are important to his second term and to American security. A second reason was that it was crucial to align our policies now in the areas I'll describe, when we have a new Israeli government and he's fresh into a second term. He got it right. He hit all the right notes emotionally and historically, and polls have shown a dramatic improvement in his standing, which I think will stand him well. And policy has been aligned, as he had hoped, in 3 of the 4 big issues, but not in the 4th. So let's take those, because they're also global forces, and I'm putting it now into the context of the President's visit. The first was a much closer coordination on Iranian nuclear policy. This is resulting not only from the President's visit, but from the healthy internal debate in Israel, which resulted from some of the announcements by the Prime Minister and the former Defense Minister Barak about potential preemptive attacks against Iran. And those voices from former senior heads of the Israel Defense Forces, former heads of the Mossad, former heads of the Shin Bet, were that this is a bad idea. So combined with the President's own persuasion, what we have coming out of the President's visit is a willingness by the new Israeli government, headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu again, to give sanctions a chance to work. Now, I was in charge of sanctions policy in the Clinton administration, and I can say without equivocation that the sanctions which the President and the United States have gotten the Europeans and others to join in against Iran are without exception the broadest, most comprehensive sanctions ever exacted against a country in peacetime. The Iranian currency has depreciated by 80% in a year. Inflation and unemployment are soaring. Iran gets over 70% of its revenues from the export of oil, and it now can only export half the oil it could before the sanctions were put into effect. The real question is, will this translate into a change in their nuclear policy? Are they willing to take the pain in order to achieve a nuclear Iran? Now, I want to suggest to you that 2013 is a year of decision. One of three things will happen by the end of this year. The first is we will, perhaps option one and the best option, have a diplomatic solution. And the talks that are now going on in Azerbaijan are showing a glimmer of hope. And just this week, Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei said that he was willing to have bilateral negotiations directly with the U.S. on this issue, I think because of the sanctions. That's option one. The second option is, this is the old Iranian game. They're going to play out these negotiations for everything they're worth, giving a little here, giving a little there. In the meantime, 2,800 centrifuges, many of them underground, are churning out enriched uranium, which by, I would say, 12 to 18 months will be enough to build a bomb. They're working on nuclear triggers, on miniaturization. They already have missiles that can reach Israel and Eastern Europe and the Gulf states, who are just as concerned about a nuclear Iran as Israel. Israel's not alone. But that's the best option. The second option is that as they sort of string us along in these negotiations, they will have crossed the point of no return, and they will have nuclear capability. They may not actually, and probably won't, actually test a bomb, but they will have a screwdriver they can put a bomb together with very quickly. And the third option is war. Now, war is a profound option anytime, but it is particularly profound when we've just gone out of one war in Iraq, are extricating ourselves from a second in Afghanistan, when we've lost over 4,000 young kids and tens of thousands of others who have been maimed, and hundreds of billions of dollars have gone. It is a very profound judgment. This is where one word sums it all up: trust. For Israel, this is an existential issue. It's a security issue for the United States and for Europe. It's an existential issue for Israel. Israel must have confidence that at the end of the day, if sanctions and diplomacy don't work, that the United States will take all actions necessary, whether by cyber attacks, which have already occurred against the Iranian nuclear operation, but not sufficiently to really stop it, or other military action. Now, permit me to say, and I'm speaking only for myself, I profoundly hope that diplomacy works, because the other options are so bad. But if they don't, conflict and dismantling the Iranian nuclear program by force is better than having an Iran that is nuclearized. Because a nuclear Iran will shred what's left of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It will lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, which will be profoundly destabilizing for U.S. and Israeli interests. It will create a nuclear umbrella under which Iran can engage in even more support for terrorist groups than it's doing now. It will be a great defeat for the whole UN system, because 5 unanimous Security Council resolutions, including China and Russia, have urged Iran to stop enriching uranium. The whole balance of power in the region will shift. And I can assure you that the Saudi Arabians are not going to stand still for a nuclear Iran. They will get their own. I hope we don't come to this. We'll know by the end of the year whether we do. But again, if there is to be military action, I feel intensely that it needs to be the U.S. and NATO, not Israel alone. Israel has fewer military assets. They're further away. It's an extremely difficult process to get over hostile airspace with refueling. We have assets right next to Iran that can be deployed much easier. But again, trust is key. Does the president really mean, and the vice president, when they say we will not accept a nuclear Iran? I believe he does, and that we will take all action. It's critical for Israel to bring that along as well. There was also an alignment in the president's trip on Syria. The president made an important statement in Israel at the very time when there was some evidence, I think later discounted, that chemical weapons might have been used. There has been, in effect, in Syria, a proxy war going on between Iran on the one hand supporting Assad. That's their only Arab ally. If he falls, it's a profound blow to Iran. And the Sunni Muslim countries on the other, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Gulf states, all seeking Assad's ouster one way or the other. How this proxy war comes out with al-Qaeda insinuating themselves in the vacuums of power will have huge implications for us as Americans and for the Jewish community and for Israel. And the reasons are that for 39 years, as terrible as Assad and his father have been, there hasn't been one incident on the Golan Heights to break the ceasefire, not one. What happens if Syria is dismantled and a hostile regime comes on the Golan Heights? A second reason that this is so profound is because Syria is the transmission belt for Iranian arms to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And if that transmission belt can be stopped, it can substantially weaken Hezbollah and strengthen Israel's northern border. And third, and perhaps most important, is because we all know that Syria has the greatest, next to the United States and Russia, stockpile of chemical weapons in the world. And what happens when Assad falls, as he will, who will take that over? And that's why I feel so strongly that our policy is now becoming, just in the last week or so, more muscular. There's very good reason to be concerned about U.S. or Qatari or Saudi arms falling into the wrong hands in this chaotic situation. I can tell you from personal experience, because in the Carter years, one of the most important things we did, and which he does not get credit for, is arming the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, shoulder-borne missiles which knocked out Russian helicopters, and that was one of the reasons why the Russians were driven out. But what happened with those Stinger missiles is they were then transmitted ultimately to the Taliban. So there is a real concern about where these arms will go, but I think we have a better fix on that now, and that we will have more of a say-so as a result in a post-Assad Syria. The third issue on which there's alignment is Turkey. Turkey had been Israel's most important Muslim ally for decades. And even with the election of Prime Minister Erdogan and an Islamic government, relations were at least tolerable until the Gaza flotilla incident. And now, thankfully, as a result of Secretary Kerry's and the President's personal intervention, There's been a normalization of that relationship. It's profoundly important for Israel and for the United States that two allies who are at each other's teeth are now going to be working more closely together, particularly for a post-Assad Syria. The fourth and last issue, and on this I'll close, where there is not yet closure, is on the Palestinian issue. I talked about 2013 being the year for Iran. But within the next couple of years, for sure, by the end of President Obama's second term, and I think even earlier, if developments aren't changed, the two-state solution will not any longer be viable. Because the growth in the population in the territories is twice that of Israel proper. The inclusion in East Jerusalem neighborhoods of Israeli building, the potential that the so-called E1 bloc may become a place for settlements, can make a two-state solution almost impossible. Now, I was in charge of the economic dimension of the peace process in the Clinton administration. I negotiated about a half dozen times with Arafat personally. I've spent a lot of time in Gaza, you can't do that now, and in the West Bank. This is a critically important time. We have one last good opportunity to make two states for two peoples possible. And I'm telling you, we will lose it rapidly if we're not careful. These are two peoples who need to be separated until there's more trust. And we have a unique confluence of circumstances. A new Israeli government, a president dedicated and a Secretary of State, as was Hillary, to the peace process, and a leadership hanging on by a thread in the West Bank, President Assad, Abu Mazen, and his Prime Minister Fayyad, who are the best Israel will ever have to deal with. We will never have more moderate Palestinian leaders. And if they don't have something to bring home to their people, then it will strengthen Hamas. Now, mind you, this by no means is all on Israel's shoulders. Abbas and the Palestinians have lost opportunity after opportunity. In 2000, at the second Camp David summit, with Prime Minister Barak and Arafat and President Clinton, Barak offered more than 95% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem as the capital, a modest return of Palestinians, and it was turned down. 2008, Prime Minister Olmert offered even more of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as the capital, and it was turned down by Abbas. So we have a situation in which we know what the solution is. It's the Clinton parameters. Everybody can sit down on a piece of paper and write them out in 5 minutes. But the political will on both sides is not yet present. I hope the President's visit helped do that on both sides, but it's certainly not clear. So what do you do in the interim if the two-state solution can't be immediately resolved? And here I talk in my book about the diplomatic equivalent of the medical Hippocratic Oath. A doctor takes that oath and basically says, if I can't cure the patient, at least do no harm. And that means at least preserve the status quo with respect to settlements. Don't have a greater and greater and greater projection into the West Bank, making an eventual settlement, if it occurs, more and more difficult. These are all areas where, again, we have a co-joining of interests of the United States, of Israel, and the Jewish people. And I want to close by one thought that's sort of the circle of what I opened with. I talked about the survival of the Jewish people over 3 millennia with all these calamities. But let's put it into this context. We now have a third Jewish state, 2,000 years after the second, fulfilling the biblical prophecy of Jeremiah after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, in which he prophesied the return from the four corners of the world, those in exile, as he put it, women in travail and women with child, the sick and the ill. A great company will come back, and they have. And they've come back and created the most modern, high-tech, strong state. In effect, all the empires which have sought to destroy the Jewish people, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Greeks and the Romans, the czars, the Nazis, and the communists, are themselves on the dustbin of history. And the Jewish people live, they have their own state, and they have an ally in the United States, which, to me, presents a profoundly positive future for all of us. Thank you very much. So I'll be glad to take questions, and since this is a serious topic, I'll start with a humorous story. When I was in the White House with President Carter, I dealt with probably one senator more than almost any others, Russell Long from Louisiana, because he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and much of our domestic legislation went there, and he was very colorful, but not nearly as colorful as his father, the kingfish, Huey Long. And Russell told me the following story, that when Russell, was a young lad growing up in the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, Papa came home stone cold drunk, staggered up the front stairs of the governor's mansion, and with a very shaky hand finally got the key in the keyhole to a line, turned the key, the door opened, and Russell on the other side of the door holding on to Mama's apron strings, his mother and the governor's wife, saw Papa collapse in the foyer, with Mama looking sternly down for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have occurred to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said, Papa, without stopping, said, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks, and I'll now take questions from the floor. So I've only got water here, I want to assure you.
Well, given the time, I'll forego at least one or two of my questions, but I did want to ask you, in your book, just one thought to continue the question of the Palestinian issue. You say that the Arab Spring not only has resulted in less US influence in the region, but also increased hostility towards Israel, which will continue at least until the Palestinian issue is resolved with a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Well, there are a lot of people who would counter that. That may be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient to ever bring a reconciliation.
Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, the Palestinian issue is a rallying cry that is used to obfuscate other problems in the Arab world. If it's solved, it does help remove one of the impediments, but the Arab revolutions aren't about the Palestinian issue. They are a profound domestic cry for opportunity, for empowerment, for jobs, for education. And the Israel issue is a sideline to that. So it's an important, but as you say, it's an ingredient, but by no means the central ingredient.
Tom Johnson, yes.
Who can we trust within the Iranian High Command to bring about some form of agreement to prevent a war?
I'm going to repeat very briefly for the sound system. Who can we trust within the Iranian hierarchy to bring about a change?
Well, first of all, one of my first jobs after Harvard Law School was working in the Johnson White House, and Tom Johnson was in a much more elevated position than I was as a junior aide. So you were used to answering questions, not asking them, but I'll be glad to try.
Here at CNN changed.
I mean, the answer is there is no one within the Iranian government that we can trust. And so it's what President Reagan said so brilliantly after one of the arms negotiations with the Russians: trust but verify. The only way we can trust Iran to honor an agreement, and I'm going to outline in a minute what that agreement ought to look like, is to have intensive, intrusive inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which, by the way, it is a UN body, but it has been fantastic in its objectivity and its probity. Because if they, Tom, throw the UN observers out, that is a clear signal that they've decided to go nuclear. Absolutely clear signal. Now, what would a deal look like? And that begins to tell you how you can verify it. And this is a deal, by the way, which the United States and the West, the so-called G5+1, Security Council plus Germany, are much more likely to take than the Israelis, because we have somewhat different end games. But what Iran has been doing is taking uranium, which was enriched to a 3.5% level, which is not military grade, and most recently in the last 18 months have been enriching it to 20%, which is still not weapons grade, but is very easily convertible within weeks to the 90% level. So the proposition is all of their 20% enriched uranium goes out of the country for reprocessing. The Russians, by the way, and the French have agreed to do this, and it can then be sent back into civilian nuclear fuel that doesn't have a military component. So it's that kind of policy that is verifiable if the Iranians will agree to it. And we also have very good telemetry and satellite technology and other things which can really be used to verify agreements.
Yes, I can. Second row.
Ambassador Eizenstat, and from Miami, you have many good friends there, like Marv Rosen and Luis Laredo. Last time I saw you was in Riga, that conference on Holocaust assets, and you look the same.
Looks are deceiving.
Perhaps you can shed light, and maybe I'm the only person from Latin America here, about the increasing danger of Iranian engagement in Latin America.
Yes.
Question on Iranian engagement in Latin America.
You know, when I talked about globalization and the shift to power, I mean, I mentioned a number of countries like Brazil and Russia and India and China and Indonesia and Turkey. Iran also sees itself as an emerging power. I mean, it's got 70 million people, highly sophisticated, highly educated, highly motivated, with a very strong technological base, as their nuclear program indicates. And they are trying to fish in our waters in Latin America to project their influence. And most troubling, they've made some inroads in Brazil, but most troubling is Argentina. Very, very troubling that the president of Argentina is really playing a very dangerous game with Iran. And most tellingly, I mean, it's just, I don't know if anybody's been to Buenos Aires, but if you go to Buenos Aires, there are two things that you have to go to. It's a beautiful city. First is the remains of the Israeli embassy, which was blown up by Iranian-trained Hezbollah people who were expelled by the Argentine government at the time. And then 2 years different, 192, 194, was AMIA, which was the Jewish Community Center of now rebuilt, magnificent building now, but destroyed. About 170 people were killed again, total civilians, non-combatants in every way, shape, or form. And there has been, I mean, the Iranian government at the time, again, had 5 of their diplomats expelled, one of whom is now a senior minister in the government, okay? So what does the president of Argentina propose? To investigate this 1990s era with a joint Argentine-Iranian commission. I mean, it's laughable if it weren't so tragic. And that's why, again, I think so much rides on succeeding on this nuclear front, because if they succeed, their influence grows all over the world, including Latin America. And it's why it's so important that Assad fall, because he is their only ally in the Arab world. You know, they're a Muslim but not an Arab country. They're a Shiite, not a Sunni country. They're not welcomed in most of the Arab world. And if we can get rid of Assad and put any semblance of a moderate government together, which will be devilishly difficult, it will be an enormous defeat for Iran all over the world. And you'll see much less Argentine-Iranian cooperation, I assure you.
So my question is sort of a segue to Hezbollah, and you mentioned Hezbollah in Argentina, but so the Burgas bombing in Bulgaria last summer, they recently said that they came out with a ruling, the legal ruling, that Hezbollah was in fact responsible for that in Europe. I think many of us know that we're trying to get Hezbollah on the list of, you know, terrorists, but it seems that Europe is recalcitrant and they don't want to approach it that way. I guess it's a two-part question. How do we approach that and get them looked at as a terrorist organization? And then the other part of the question is, once Assad does leave, what will happen to Hezbollah?
The
Okay.
question is, with Hezbollah, how do we get the Europeans to declare them a terrorist organization? And what will happen to Hezbollah if Assad falls?
Okay, so I was ambassador to the EU, and I think a good deal about how they think. First, let me suggest on Iran, not your question, but it's important to. I would never have imagined that the Europeans would have taken the kind of tough actions against Iran that they've taken now. Never. I mean, they get 18% of their oil from Iran. We don't get any. They cut all oil imports off as of July 1 last year. All Iranian oil imports, at a time when they were in economic distress. They work with us to expel 30 private Iranian banks from the so-called SWIFT system in Brussels, through which all international transactions have to be cleared. Iran can't do any business in dollars, in euros, in any hard currency. They have to do barter. So, I mean, I want to give the Europeans their due in acting in this way. On Hezbollah, it's been very disappointing. Hezbollah has been on our terrorist list, which means they can't raise money in the United States, they can't raise money from U.S. citizens, and Europe stubbornly refuses to recognize them as a terrorist group, thinking somehow that they want to keep a political relationship with Hezbollah. Now, there have been two things that have actually happened in the last few weeks. One you mentioned in Bulgaria, where a court found that the bombing of a tourist bus with about 70 Israeli tourists was a Hezbollah action, and they got the actual perpetrator to admit that. But the second, which got less publicity, was in Cyprus. I mean, everybody's been reading about the banking crisis in Cyprus, but the Cypriots arrested someone who was planning another attack and again admitted. Now, this was, an Iranian-led, Hezbollah-led operation. So these are two EU member states. And I think within the next month, you will see, in a limited way, the EU add Hezbollah to the terrorist list, meaning they can't raise money in Europe, but they won't sever all relations with them. But even that will be important.
Yeah, I was just
Because we've got very little time.
Yeah, I was at an event last week where the head of an Israeli hospital and a Christian group came, and they are having a program where they bring Palestinian kids to the hospital and treat them, sick, poor kids in Palestine, which I was very impressed with. And at Emory, we're having a humanitarian summit where the richest man from Kuwait comes, and we're going to try to get them to help financially support that as well. And I'm just wondering, is there any movement to take things like that where you just do humanitarian things and try to link the people together?
That's a really good question.
How much humanitarian effort has been made?
It's a really good question because at a
Palestinians?
time when the political process at the top has been frozen, it's important to work from the bottom up. And let me give you some examples. You mentioned one, but what's happened is a whole generation of young Israelis have had no contact with Palestinians. Before the first and then second intifadas, Israelis regularly went into the West Bank as tourists, to buy. There was some interaction. There's none now. So what's being done is there are efforts by a number of groups to put Israeli and Palestinian young people together for camps and other activities. The World Economic Forum in Davos has worked on a very important initiative. They had in January, they had 50 Palestinian business people, 50 Israeli business people, 50 Americans who were both business and academics to try to build business-to-business linkages, create interdependence there. That's the kind of thing from the bottom up that's going to be necessary at a time, again, when the process is frozen. So it's a very good question, and we need to have more of that, and it needs to be publicized. I think you had a question.
I just had a quick question regarding the Iron Dome. There was
Yes.
Times recently had a story about its effectiveness. I was wondering if Netanyahu will take a page from Obama and start investing in the Iron Dome program.
The question was about the effectiveness of the Iron Dome program and whether the United States might be taking that.
Or if Israel will take any sort of information, glean anything from Obama's use of it.
Yeah.
Exchange of information.
I mean, the president pointedly visited an Iron Dome facility on his trip. This is a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. It is estimated to have blocked about 80% of the incoming rockets from Gaza, not 100%, but about 80%. It's being perfected. More batteries are being put up. It worked, frankly, much better than people thought. We're developing our own system and deploying it on the West Coast in terms of North Korea. This is jointly funded, jointly shared, joint intelligence is being used, and it's another example of this sort of extraordinary bilateral partnership.
There's a last question right at the back, sir. Yes.
Sir, you have indicated that China is now growing economically and the military power is also growing. And if you see on the map, China is one of the neighbors of Iran. And recently, the relation that they have built with Syria, it indicates that America has withdrawn from Afghanistan and the same to Iraq. Would they like to keep the power with the coordination with the Iranians?
Okay, so the question, I guess, is the China-Iran relationship. China is really an incredibly fascinating country. I mean, in the last 10 years, they leapfrogged to be the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, then the 2nd most powerful economy in the world, and by 2030, the 1st. They will overcome us, although not on a per capita basis. So that's the first thing. The second thing is China does not have a history of anti-Semitism. Ironically, Judaism is not one of the 5 recognized religions in Israel, and so the Chabad movement, for example, has to, in China, excuse me. Judaism is not one of the 5 recognized religions in China, and so the Chabad movement in China has to practice in both Beijing and Shanghai underground. But there really isn't a history of anti-Semitism, and indeed they take great pride in the fact that Shanghai was an open port, and a lot of Shanghai Jews were saved from Europe as a result. Third, the China-Iran relationship is not ideological. It is purely 100% driven by economic need, and in particular minerals. China is thirsty for minerals of all kinds: oil, gas, aluminum, silicon. I mean, for this incredibly vast and growing economy. And that's why there's 750,000 Chinese workers in Africa today. And so China is the biggest miscreant in terms of the embargo on Iranian oil. They've very modestly cut back, but they really are very large purchasers, not because they want to be, because they feel they have to be. So this is a heavily economic-driven relationship, and we have to simply take that into account. But China is part of the so-called P5, the Security Council members. They did vote, although not with any enforceable unilateral sanctions. They voted with all the other Security Council members against the Iranian nuclear program. They do not want a nuclear Iran on their border. So there's something to work with respect to China. They'll come along if we reach an agreement, but they're certainly not going to take the lead in it. And I guess one last thing on China. You know, when I talked about the loss of influence of the United States in the Middle East, which is profound, I mean, the president goes to Jerusalem in 2013. He doesn't go to Cairo like he did in 2009, because he knows if he went to Cairo, there would be real problems. But if there's a good news to this, it is there's no other great power to fill that vacuum. Russia is, you know, they call it a brick country. It really isn't. It's almost totally dependent on energy, no modernization, tremendous corruption. It can't fill that void like the Soviet Union could have, and neither can China. And China doesn't want to. It just wants oil. It doesn't want the political influence. So we've now got a Middle East with no major dominant power. And if there's any, we have more than anybody else, we have a lot less than we used to. And that creates the kind of chaotic situation we're going to have to live with for a very long time. Thank you very much, and I'll be signing. I do want to say